ideally, open source could bypass centralized AI. This might take 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But like theoretically, it makes sense why it should, because you just have these contributors that are distributed all over the world. And it's actually really interesting because like I've noticed even centralized companies leaning into like this crowdsourcing of intelligence, which is essentially what Bittensor is. And it's saying, hey, whoever can come compete here and can do a good job will be rewarded accordingly.
So got Sami back on the pod here. First things first is I wanna plug our previous Bittensor episode with the Bittensor co-founders Jake and Ala. I think we put it out back in January before Bittensor blew up, and I think it's still our most listened to episode. And it was Sami and I here co-hosting it back when he was my co-host on the Proof of Coverage podcast. So if you want to hear about Bittensor from the founders themselves before all the craziness of the last 9 months, go check that out. It's on YouTube, Spotify, everywhere. Came out in mid-January, I think. But with no further ado, Sami, how are you?
Doing well, man. TAO was at what, like $50 when we pushed that podcast out? And that was probably, I don't know, like the highest energy podcast that I've been on. Jake or Const and Allah were just like amazing people to interview. But yeah, like the timing of that podcast was perfect because I think maybe like a month later is when TAO just started kind of like surging in price. So I think it's also the only podcast that Jake or Const has done. He's done some like fireside chats with like DCG and maybe a couple others, but like he hasn't been on any other podcast. So that makes me feel good.
Well, gotta give credit where it's due to the TAO King himself, Sami, right here. Wouldn't have happened without you, man.
It feels weird to be on this side of the interview, like because I'm so used to co-hosting with you. I feel like we're just waiting for the actual like, guest to show up, and I'm just like, we're just kind of like wasting time right now, like kicking the can around. But yeah, it's great to be back. I mean, I've missed you. I've missed the boys,
you too, man.
And yeah, looking forward to chatting for the next 30 minutes.
100%. Yeah, you can always come on and co-host whenever you'd like if there's an interesting founder or investor you want to talk with.
Yeah, I mean, we did Iris together, right? And that's supposed to come out soon.
That's coming out today, actually, I think. So excited for that. Yeah, let's just jump right into it in terms of what is Bittensor aiming to do and why is it important to that average non-crypto person?
Good question. So yeah, the way I would describe Bittensor to my mom or even like, let's say an average person is that hopefully, actually like this is tough because my mom probably doesn't even know what OpenAI is or who Claude or not Claude, like Anthropic and some of these big AI labs are. But I think most people are familiar with some of these centralized AI labs. And the comparison I would make is that Bittensor is the equivalent of a decentralized OpenAI or a decentralized Anthropic, a decentralized Google Mind, where its objective is to produce intelligence, machine intelligence, in a decentralized manner. So if you look at OpenAI, they handle the entire process of producing intelligence, from collecting data, labeling that data, training on that data, and then hosting the model for inference, or even productizing it as well with like ChatGPT. And Bittensor's vision is to do exactly that, where it's this decentralized platform that allows developers to launch these very specific networks that are called subnets. And so a subnet could be focused on, say, scraping data. There's another one that's focused on chunking that data. There could be one that is focused, or there is one on, putting vector embeddings into that data, or pushing, I don't know the technical term, basically like translating those into vector embeddings. And that's just like in the data stack, right? Then there's like multiple subnets that are actually doing training, fine tuning, and then even inferencing subnets. So the idea is that everything needed to produce like a decentralized ChatGPT, which is like the end product in which could be considered intelligence, could be done within Bittensor, which is this decentralized platform. And to answer your the second part of your question, which is like, why is this important? I think it's become pretty obvious over the past year, especially with just like how much AI is already becoming integrated into our daily lives and the reliance that we have on it and the power that these centralized AI companies have. It's very difficult to know like what type of biases are embedded into the models. What was the model actually trained on? Like these centralized AI labs are black boxes, right? And so to think that like they are dictating information that we are ingesting is sort of a very scary concept. And so how I see decentralized AI is the counterweight to centralized AI, the same way that Bitcoin is the counterweight to fiat.
100% makes sense. So yeah, I think the framing of decentralized AI lab is definitely easily understandable for sure. And then in terms of why it's important, also having open source kind of free like competition.
Yeah, that's like a good way to also describe Bittensor is that it allows open source AI to flourish. So it doesn't like the intelligence that's being produced there doesn't necessarily need to be open source, but it allows developers wanting to work on open source to monetize their work, right? So like if somebody wanted to fine tune a llama model, for example, they could do so within like a specific subnet that's running a fine tuning competition, and they could be rewarded for their work. Whereas previously, a lot of these open source contributions were because was happening because people enjoyed it, and it was sort of like a hobby, right? But there was no like financial incentive, and like Bittensor is essentially creating this financial incentive for open source contributions. So that's a good point.
Well, that's kind of how I was thinking about like OSS Capital, open source software, kind of the thesis of the fund. Like I think JJ said on Twitter, open source is the most competitive accelerant humanity has ever discovered, far greater than capitalism. And true open source ecosystems or software, I think, are probably the purest form of competition, and also probably progress humanity the fastest. I think like we've seen that somewhat with like Elon's open sourcing of various parts of different companies he's built. Like he's willing to do it because I think he said it like accelerates humanity's transition to electric vehicles, for instance. But you also need to make money, and there also needs to be an incentive to work on these things. And so it kind of seems to me like Bittensor is the combination of open source and of ethos and free markets, but also layers in the capitalism kind of financial incentive component, which I think is what makes it so powerful.
Yeah, and I want to touch on first the first thing that you said, which is how open source accelerates the rate of innovation. And this is something that JJ really instilled in me, which was like the only moat that companies have is their like how fast they're innovating, how fast they're improving their product, how fast they're developing new products. Like that's really the only moat that exists nowadays. Like, and this is something I struggled with and something I was sort of trying to answer for a while, specifically for Bittensor. Like, what is Bittensor's moat? And I could, there's like a few ways I could answer this question, like one being the miners as like the prime network effect, which essentially creates this moat. But really, like going back to what JJ's just like instilled in me is that it's how fast can Bittensor continue to innovate and stay ahead of competitors. So that's one, just like the power of open source. And so ideally, open source could bypass centralized AI. This might take 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but like theoretically, it makes sense why it should, because you just have these contributors that are distributed all over the world. And it's actually really interesting because like I've noticed even centralized companies leaning into like this crowdsourcing of intelligence, which is essentially what Bittensor is. So Jane Street, for example, which is this quant trading firm, they've launched this like competition on Kaggle, which is essentially trying to incentivize people to develop financial market forecasting models. And so this is just like a really good example because it shows like Jane Street, which is very well capitalized, which has some of the smartest people in the world, is looking to the broader world to be like, hey, we can't even figure this out. So like if someone out there, whether they're in Europe, Africa, whatever continent, whatever country, can crack this challenge, then like we will reward them for such. And that's like exactly what Bittensor is doing, where it's like creating these individual competitions, and it's saying, hey, whoever can come compete here and can do a good job will be rewarded accordingly.
Yeah, in a world where you're judged on the quality of your decisions and you can multiply the quality of those decisions with capital, compute, anything else, kind of like the leverage that you put behind those decisions, I think you almost have to open up the inputs to that system to the world. Like if there's one person out there, in some country that we've never heard of that has legitimately better kind of knowledge or ability to construct like a financial forecasting model for Jane Street, they need to find that person, because if they find that person and they put a bunch of capital behind them, like the returns generated could be crazy. And I think the same thing applies to AI. If someone can create like a legitimately better model or more efficient model, you need to put all the whoever, Bittensor, OpenAI, whoever needs to put all their resources behind that person or behind that model. And so by open sourcing things and having kind of an open incentive mechanism as well, you can attract those people and you can find them. So I think that's what, is really interesting about Bittensor.
Yeah, and going back to that Jane Street example with their Kaggle competition, so they had like a total of $100,000 in rewards, with $50,000 going to whoever creates the like most performant forecasting model. And it's interesting because essentially what they're doing on Kaggle exists as a subnet within Bittensor, which is subnet 8, which is this proprietary trading network. And so traders and machine learning professionals enter that subnet and basically compete to provide the best actionable trading insights. But what's interesting there is like every day at this point in time, at the current TAO price of like 550, there's around $52,000 that's available for miners. And that's just per day. And so if you look at what Jane Street is offering is $50,000 as a one-time payment for whoever, cracks this challenge. And that's sort of the difference that I see between like some of these centralized platforms like Kaggle and Bittensor, where like Bittensor is this like continuous benchmark or challenge. And really like the way that it wins is by offering the largest incentive. So like the way that you get somebody to contribute to the Bittensor subnet rather than Kaggle is be like, hey, you can make way more money here. And so again, like there's two types of incentives for people, right? Like extrinsic and intrinsic. And so like a lot of people are extrinsically motivated, which means like they want financial incentives. And so for that reason, they should be attracted to Bittensor. But at the same time, people who are like intrinsically motivated, who want to like contribute to open source out of just like the goodness of their heart, could also be attracted to Bittensor for that reason, because they're contributing to this larger mission and objective of like decentralized AI, and not just like, hey, we're going to give this model to Jane Street so that they can just go and like extract value.
For sure. Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool to hear. You've definitely done some thinking on like the different levels of incentives. And I think it's a really great example of just the differences between like open source and closed source type of competitions. But I know you're obviously a huge Bittensor bull. I think you've probably illustrated that case on a couple of different podcasts. I also want to hear, maybe anything you wish had happened differently in the past for Bittensor, or things you want to change in the future? So just areas where you see that there could be improvement, or where you see there could be a potential issue down the road, and what you and others in the community are thinking about in terms of avoiding those or mitigating those.
So Bittensor is far from perfect. And hopefully the maxi crowd doesn't, kill me for what I'm about to say. But I think it's widely accepted that there are a lot of flaws within Bittensor, but there are solutions that are being developed that will, I guess, like solve these problems, right? And so the biggest problem within Bittensor right now is like the emission distribution system. So like there's 7,200 TAO minted every day. And the main challenge of the network is like, how do we decide how emissions are distributed to each subnet? Like, subnet 8, that trading subnet that I just talked about, like who gets to decide how much of that 7,200 flows to that subnet in terms of rewards? And the initial solution was, okay, let's just take the 64 largest validators or like token holders on the network and allow them to have a vote in how emissions are distributed. So like pretty much a DAO. Like let's have a DAO run this. And we like, if you've been in crypto for more than a year, you know that DAOs are like very ineffective at everything, right? And so what's actually ended up happening is there's like 5 validators that control roughly like 67% of the overall circulating supply. That's not all their tokens, right? It's a lot of delegated tokens, but it's essentially 5 validators that are getting to make the decision at the end of the day on how these emissions are distributed. So very centralized. And there's a lot of problems with this system. Like there's been drama related to a lot of like inside deals happening with validators and subnet owners. And so the obvious solution here is like dynamic TAO. And like I want to avoid getting really deep into dynamic TAO, but the overall concept of it is emission distribution moves from like this manual voting process by a centralized group to a market-based system. And it's hopefully going to be a lot more efficient than how emissions are being distributed now. So that's like probably the biggest problem within Bittensor at this point in time. But like I said, there's an identified solution that will, the foundation is saying, likely be implemented by the end of the year. Outside of that, there's like some small problems here and there, but really like the Bittensor bet is that like this community will continue to iterate and refine these different mechanisms as time goes on, right? And I think like this has sort of been validated over time with a lot of like patches to the protocol. Like there had been an exploit at one point, not with the actual protocol, but in the like overall system that had been fixed. And so like over time, there have been some challenges. Those challenges have been addressed. And like the long-term bet with Bittensor is that this community, which I would argue is probably like top 5 largest communities in all of crypto, maybe top 10, but like I would honestly think like, top 5 or 6, is just so committed to this protocol to where like they will continue to support it, continue to improve it. And it's because the narrative is just so kind of attractive at this time, right? Like we could probably talk about these AI meme coins, but like Bittensor essentially is an AI meme coin the same way that Bitcoin is a meme, right? It's just people believe in the mission, which is we want to create this like non-sovereign form of money, or like this asset that we can preserve our wealth in. Whereas like Bittensor is sort of like, we want to develop this system that can produce decentralized intelligence. And so people align with that mission and are willing to contribute their time. And so where, Bittensor at this point in time, there are a lot of subnets are contributing value or like, producing something useful and tangible. We're still pretty far away, maybe not too far away, but from, the first subnet like going mainstream, right? And so, but with all the belief behind it, I don't think it will take long until we do have that like breakout application or breakout subnet.
For sure. I mean, the whole open source nature of it and how many different subnets are being worked on at once means that the pace of just iteration improvement is pretty high. And I think we've already seen a lot of evolution in the Bittensor ecosystem. Even going from no subnets to subnets was a pretty like fundamental change, but things move fast out here. We've got just a couple minutes left. I want to cover one thing I think a lot of people are curious about, which is why are you so bullish on Bittensor from like a career perspective? So left Masari, left to deepen focus, which we're sad about, left me on the pod for to kind of double, triple down on Bittensor. So what's that journey been like for you in terms of like just building that level of conviction in a project, a token, a community, and how's the journey been so far?
I will say I haven't abandoned Deepin. Like in one way, you can also look at Bittensor as a platform or L1 for Deepins, but I'll sort of get to that. Towards like the last year of being at Masari, I was heavily focused on the intersection of crypto and AI. And it's funny because like 2 years ago, after the ChatGPT moment, there was maybe like 5 crypto AI projects. And like, to be honest, most of them were shit, like vaporware type of projects. And I was writing this report on this intersection. I ended up coming across Bittensor, and one thing led to another, and I kind of fell down this rabbit hole and sort of became sucked in. And this was around February of 2023. I thought it was really interesting, but it wasn't until October of 2023 when the subnet upgrade came out, to where my background in Deepin allowed me to sort of see this vision where there would be all these very specific networks that could utilize crypto economic incentive mechanisms to motivate people towards a specific objective, right? The same way that Helium just uses these incentive mechanisms to get people to deploy hotspots. The same way that HiveMapper does it with dash cams. The same way that Demo does it with their little, I don't know what you want to call it, the
dongle.
The little dongle, yeah. And so because of like my background there, I was able to see like, okay, you could do the same thing with like AI related objectives, right? So like, incentivize people to train a model, incentivize people to scrape data, incentivize people to, even fine tune models, whatever, like the entire AI stack could sort of be like unbundled, and you could have an incentive mechanism for each component. So I'm sort of drifting away from your initial question, but like Deepin really allowed me to build conviction on Bittensor. And towards the end of my time at Masari, I was looking for kind of my next adventure, and I saw the vision of crypto AI, and I wanted to make like a very focused bet there. And coincidentally, I had connected with JJ, and he really shared the same vision that I had, which was, Bittensor could become like this AI and Deepin platform. So I sort of just like had this really strong feeling after like evaluating the community, seeing how strong it was, looking at the types of people contributing to this network, and like from spending so much time at Masari and evaluating all these different protocols, there's just something that stood out about Bittensor in terms of like, okay, they're not just like marketing these like valueless partnerships. There are actually people who are contributing, who aren't here for like, who aren't mercenaries, who are going after these grants that a foundation is offering for builders. Like it was just people who were genuinely interested, and very smart people. And like, I sort of connected everything together, and I was like, this could be big. And one thing led to another, and I kind of went all in. And I'm really glad that I made that decision. Obviously, there's still like nothing is certain, right? So like I'm talking as if Bittensor has already succeeded. And in one way it has, right? Like it is, in my opinion, and many other people believe, the category leader within AI, decentralized AI. But like there's still a lot of time left. There's a lot of competitors. But again, it just goes back to that rate of innovation, right? There's so many people who are contributing to different subnets, contributing to the actual protocol. And so the bet is that Bittensor will maintain its lead. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping, in a year we can do this again, and TAO will be a lot higher than it is today, and there will be a lot, stronger teams building on it. And yeah, I'm excited about the future.
100%. Well, that's a great place to leave it, Sami. Thank you for coming on. Where would you like us to point listeners to?
Yeah, definitely follow me on Twitter. It's at @old_Samster. I always crack up when I have to like give my Twitter on podcasts. Follow JJ. He's at @JosephJax_, I believe. And then check out taopill.ai. It's this website that me and this team called Wombo put together, which is like this catalog of subnets, and we sort of periodically update it with updates about like subnet achievements. So it's a good place to stay up to date on the Bittensor ecosystem.
It is the resource to point people to. All right,
Yeah.
Sami, thanks for coming on, man.
All right, man. This was lovely. Connor, lovely. All right, have a good one, man.